consent to recording. All right, so good morning and thank you all for joining me as we discuss your amazing chapter, utilizing the intersectional perspective to shift individual systems and practices. So I really liked how you all kind of rooted the chapter in the very beginning, that introductory chapter, into a conversation on what intersectionality is and the intersections within us. We hear that word a lot: intersections, intersectionality, identity, so on and so forth, a lot today, but I'm unsure if we're all really talking about the same thing. So to kind of get us all on the same page with this discussion, what are intersections and what is intersectionality? And I'll leave that to anyone in the group to kick us off.
So our intersections really are where our social identity characteristics kind of overlap. And so I emphasize social identity characteristics because it's all of those socially constructed identities that we're really focused on. Because through that social construction of those different identities, you have the different aspects of power or levels of power ascribed to that identity characteristic. And so with intersectionality, it really is that observance and analysis of your power imbalances that are related to or a part of that social identity characteristic and how that overlaps and intersects with another identity characteristic and impacts that person's experience and makes it a little bit different than another person who has different intersecting identities.
Nice, thank you. So I guess that would kind of work into the mindset or frame that, let's say me, right? I can have my male identity that's more or less socially constructed. And then I have the scholar identity and the youth identity and how all of that plays and how some of that gives me power. The maleness definitely in the United States gives me some sort of power, but my interracial identity takes, or maybe not takes, but kind of weakens some of that. So it all kind of plays together in this giant balancing beam.
Exactly. So both of us are going to be in academia, but your experience versus my experience are going to be different, right? With the power imbalance due to me having an identity of being female and also Black. We might both be appear Black, right? But you've identified as interracial. And so those are two different experiences because both of our identities have different levels of power ascribed to it by our larger societies and communities.
Awesome, thank you for that. So also in that introductory paragraph, you illustrated how both privilege and lack of privilege at those intersections, and we just kind of discussed that a little bit, we're there, of like socioeconomic status, gender identity. If we think of just ourselves and how many intersections there are in just us, there are a lot. There's so many. I could probably list a whole list of 15, 20 just off the top of my head. Where do we begin to understand and then authentically affirm and include all parts of everyone's identity in the classroom?
Right, I think that is a very hard thing to do because we're so programmed to really just look at the things that we see. And the things that we see are also created by our own perspective of what is power or what is important and what is not. And those also relate to kind of what has power and what doesn't. So what we have to do is also look at and kind of use that intersectional lens to really take a step back and look at, hey, what are the things that I do just automatically notice and ascribe different meanings to? Why do I do that? And how is that impacting the classroom, or how is that impacting the child? right? And then also look at, if I'm just going to observe how the other students are interacting with one another, how are their different identity characteristics impacting how they interact with each other? Because when children are growing up, it's such a beautiful time because they're figuring out, who am I, right? They're trying to figure that out and answer that question. So they're going to kind of figure out, what is my sexuality? What is my gender identity? What is, XYZ? But they're also figuring out at that same time, what is the power or lack thereof related to these different things that might feel authentic or feel natural to me? And is it something that I want to show, or is it something that I want to conceal? And so I think we have to also think about how children are picking up and internalizing those power imbalances and how it's impacting how they are interacting with the world around them, and how we see how those outcomes of how's that impacting their mental health, how's that impacting their self-worth, how's that impacting their academic performance, how is that impacting their social activities with their peers, with you as their teacher or their principal or their whatever, right? Because it's really taking that time to figure out and understand, because they're not just a collection of identities. They're a collection of, yes, these identities, but also the impact of those intersections of those identities, of living in that had those different power imbalances and how it is impacting how they are figuring out how they have to traverse the world. So it's not just about, let me figure out all I can learn about the LGBTQ community and figure that out, or let me learn everything about the Latinx community, or let me learn all about this community, that community, and figuring out. It's about, let me understand all of these different levels of access and lack of access and barriers that are created, that are impacting how my students are interacting with the learning material. They're interacting with me as an adult. They're interacting with each other, because that's really at the heart of it. And when you figure that out, then you allow them to continue to figure out and play around with who I am as a growing student, a kindergartner or a 12th grader, right? Because they need to have that freedom to try those different things out, to try out, well, what is my style? What is something that I feel passionate about? What is a way that I'm going to be able to express when I need help? Because that's a hard thing to do, right? All of these things are very vulnerable things that they need to have time to be able to figure out, but they can't do that if they're already too focused and worried on, how am I just going to get through the day because I have these other social identity characteristics that are creating barriers, not of my own making, but of kind of a larger society that I'm learning about and understanding and seeing how it impacts how my teacher interacts with me, or impacts how my other peers interact with me or view me. And a lot of those times, all of those ways, all these other people are interacting with me and setting up different conversations or activities with me are based on stereotypes and not just based on who I am as an individual. Because if you really think about it, we are, of course, a collection of all these social identity characteristics, but none of those words of our race, of our gender, of our disability or ability status, or all these other things really define who you are. It's really just all those other kind of things that really just you really know and you exude in how you present yourself. And so it's when we take away all of that power, all of those identities have, and allow a person to be able to just exude all of that goodness that is them, is how we really get to see a student and value them and allow them to have that trajectory that is going to feel right to them and kind of help lead them to where they want to go.
I mean, well, after that, I think we can go ahead and post that up to a TED Talk, call it a day. We fixed education right there. See our children as humans in their unique, beautiful, individualized way. I love that. So it sounds like for the teacher who's struggling with, let's say, that lesson on, I'm going to pick something, two-step equations in algebra, right? And you're like, why aren't we getting this? It may be helpful to step back from the pedagogy, right? The just direct instruction piece and going, how am I impacting power and influencing self-concept, or the ability to ask for help, and things like that in the classroom. So taking that reflection piece a little deeper. Monica, it looks like you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I just was going to allude to what China was saying. Yeah, so this entire chapter was mostly us taking the readers, educators mostly, through a journey of self-identifying. How do educators, we got to step back and really look at these students through their social identities and so many different variables that really make them and them unique. And so sometimes we walk into classrooms and we quickly just see the social surface. And we don't really stop to think about hey, let me talk to this one student. Let me get to know them a little bit more. Why are they struggling in algebra? Why can't I ask them these questions? What am I doing as an educator that could also be impacting that social dynamic? So that's what we really wanted throughout this chapter, is to really allude to those factors that really could impact education.
Awesome. Thank
you. I would elaborate just a little bit further to say, in addition to what the educator is doing and how they may be being perceived, how is the curriculum being perceived? So are there good questions being asked? Is it inclusive kind of questions? Do students feel like they're represented in the work that they're reading and working on?
Outstanding. Thank you for that. So you used the multidimensional model of cultural competence by Sue, who published it in 2001 as your framework for your chapter. Can you kind of give us an overview of what that framework is?
Yeah, so it's kind of a factorial model that it's mainly used for mental health practitioners, psychologists, therapists, etc., for kind of really developing their cultural competence and using it within their practices and organizations. So in its kind of original form, because we kind of use it, but kind of break away, you've got your list of mainly racial identifiers as racial characteristics. So for white or Caucasian, Black, Latinx, etc., right? And provides also to that practitioner kind of a few guides for interacting with a person in those different racial categories, right? But again, it's just here's just a little guide, but this is not what you do for everybody, just something to kind of help orient you to that certain group. But then you are also looking at that through the lens of, hey, what are your kind of levels of cultural competence, right? Your cultural knowledge, your self-awareness, your attitude of openness and awareness, et cetera. And also walks you through looking at, hey, these are the things that you need to do in order for you to interact in a culturally congruent way with people of different backgrounds. And it also allows you to kind of focus in on exactly that one individual or that one family or client that you're working with. How are you going to actually use all these skills and develop all these skills to interact with that person? So what we kind of take away from that is how he breaks it down into kind of what you as the individual are going to do, what you as your behavioral health or kind of mental health organization are going to do, and then apply that to the school setting. We kind of shift and change some things to where we put 3 levels in there of the individual. So the instructor or the principal or whoever you are, And as your level 1, your level 2 being kind of the application piece. So how you're applying those skills, how you're looking at the things that you do in your classroom, you're looking at the tools that you use maybe to assess for academic skills or for social emotional skills, et cetera. And then looking at your larger organization, which would be your school, and looking at what are the things that we're doing as a school to, one, be culturally competent and be warm and welcoming, be responsive to diverse needs. And then also how we're going to educate and kind of continue that cycle of self-knowledge and learning about how we're going to continuously meet the ever-evolving needs of our communities.
Awesome. I really like how you've used that framework kind of geared towards the mental health field and applied it into education, which could use all the mental health supports we could get right now. But also in your kind of approach at cultural competence, it seems like you're not really demanding or asking or even suggesting that I, as the educator, become PhD scholar in LGBT cultural identity, Latin American identity, Asian, I need to be a mid-level understanding of the individual in my room and how all those sorts of things just kind of add some seasoning, right, to who they are as a person, and then how I can best, teach and support their growth. Does that kind of sound about right? Awesome. Yes. So it seems as we were kind of moving through the chapter, you have this wonderful section, developing self-knowledge. It was almost like a mini therapy session as I was reading it and kind of going through my own who am I stage. And you take us on that journey of developing identity and knowing how we become, what or who we are, how we think, how that impacts certain things, that power dynamic we've kind of been circling around. In terms of kind of using that, I think first to really figure out who we are as educators, right? Because even though we often frame our students as continuously evolving and trying on different hats, kind of argue that we do that our whole life. Each stage of our life, we try on a new hat. We try something different. We become different people. Can you kind of walk us through that section on developing self-knowledge?
Yeah, so that with self-knowledge, it's really is that thing that we kind of touched on first, because you can't really do any of the other aspects or any of the other pieces well without understanding yourself, right? So our whole chapter takes that intersectional perspective, and with that intersectional kind of perspective and framework, it operates again on those two levels, as both the observance and the analysis of power imbalances, in order for you to figure out how do we adjust those scales to be really more equal or equitable for an individual. So, but you can't, one, observe it, and two, analyze those power imbalances if you don't understand how those power imbalances impact you. And so that self-knowledge piece really allows for you to, one, be able to realize, hey, I actually have blinders on, and two, figure out how can I take those off to be able to see how all of these same things and systems that affect me affect other people. So with that section, you're really taking that time to really understand how have all of these ingrained systems in of power in our environments affected and have shaped you. The things that you have chosen to do, the things about maybe yourself you feel the most confident to exude and show, and the things maybe you're like, oh wait, no, I conceal that. Now I better understand why I conceal that, or why I feel like I have to go left, and even though I want to go right, now I understand how and why I have been traversing the world the way that I do, because now through that experience and of understanding myself, I have a better understanding of maybe why another person is going to interact the way they are. And then use that experience that you've gone through to see, hey, whatever another person is doing isn't wrong. It's exactly what they needed to do in order for them to reach the outcome that their intended goal, or how they're perceiving that they need to interact with the world to get through, right? So it also helps us to no longer place blame or to have some sort of judgment on other people, because now we understand, hey, there's no right or wrong when we're looking at how other people are interacting with the world. It's how they have perceived that they need to interact with the world in order to get through, right? So it helps us to make that really important shift in our thinking, so that when we're interacting with people, even if we disagree, it helps us to slow down and say, well, hey, why are they interacting with the world that way? Why, for me, hey, that seems really aggressive. But, oh, wait, if I take the time to really to understand from their perspective by asking those same questions I asked myself, by really starting to not just hone in on that individual and be like, they're yelling and screaming or da, 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 what's going on around. Oh, I now can better see the power imbalances that they are experiencing and feeling. And this is how they're regaining that power in order to get to their next goal. So that's really kind of that self-knowledge piece. And it's, of course, something that is so individual to each reader and each person that, it's also one of those things that's going to have to be, you read and read and read again. And you also, as you said, do and do again as you hit different aspects of your life, because you're going to start to see how different environments impact you, different positions impact you, different people that maybe you haven't interacted with impact you. Because we always have this tendency, to kind of go into autopilot, but it's autopilot that kind of makes our interactions get a little bit more sticky or a little bit more charged. But when we kind of really take that time and slow down and always are reevaluating and looking at ourselves, it makes it so much easier to do this type of work.
Definitely. I love how you are moving educators and just pretty much society away from judgment and stepping back and going, oh, that's wrong. Or, well, maybe just the best thing they could figure out to get what they need. Coming from the EBD self-contained and public day level, I do that all the time. He's not wrong. If I was in your shoes, I probably would have done it too, because how else am I going to navigate the system given the skills and capacity that I have at that moment? So I really like how you're nudging us away from judgment. And then you break the process of really kind of becoming that culturally competent, multidimensionally aware educator in person into stages. We kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier. We had the individual, where we're kind of really doing our self stuff, looking at how we can do it in the application phase, it's more or less the classroom level, and then more of an organizational kind of systems-wide approach. Could you give us a summary of those levels and maybe like one strategy for each?
I'll try. So at the individual level, it's really about looking at how our systems have impacted and shaped you, right? How they've impacted and shaped the power that you hold, just as yourself as a person, the power that you hold as your role that you have in schools, as that teacher, as that school psych, as that principal, as that counselor, et cetera, right? And it's all about looking at, hey, how are all of these things and identities about myself impacting, one, me, and two, impacting how I interact with others and how they interact with me, right? So it's all about being able to start to really see and understand your place in that system right now, and kind of figuring out, do I like my place? Do I like how I'm interacting? Do I like how I'm being perceived? Am I actually aware of that? Am I kind of counteracting maybe some of those negative perceptions that people might have of, like, oh, you're the principal, right? How am I addressing that power imbalance before it even comes into play, right? So I guess one really big strategy for that individual level is to take that time to look at, hey, what is the power associated with my social characteristics and my professional role? And how might that be creating barriers for students, parents, and my other coworkers that can negatively influence how others are interacting with me, how others